Interesting one on deck for you today, boxing gang. I want to talk about Mike Tyson, specifically two narratives that are all about the usual talk of the town around Tyson, his prime. That's become a dirty word now because of how badly spammed it has become, and you'll hear it in my voice every time I have to say it. Was he unstoppable and the GOAT in his prime? Was he underrated or overrated? Let's look deeper. There's a growing sentiment that Mike Tyson's body of work in the 1980s came against less than stellar competition. Bums, if you will. But is that really true? Let's evaluate what are, in my opinion, Tyson's overlooked, impressive wins. Jesse the Boogeyman Ferguson is linked to many big names of the 80s and 90s. He beat out Buster Douglas, the man who upset Tyson years later. He had a great showing against Carl Williams, who was coming off a controversial loss to Larry Holmes. He would go on to have good showings against Michael Dokes, Tony Tubbs, Oliver McCall, and most notably, upset Ray Mercer. This man was a rising young lion before Tyson knocked him out. James Quick Tillis fought the who's who of the division before and after Tyson. He had wins over Ron Stander and Ernie Shavers. He fought well against Pinklin Thomas, Greg Page, and Carl the Truth Williams. He fought terrible Tim Witherspoon too. In particular, he overcame his glaring stamina issue just before the Tyson fight and became the first man to take Kid Dynamite the distance. He continued on after Tyson against names like Frank Bruno, Evander Holyfield, and Tommy Morrison. Mike Tyson beat arguably the best version of Quick Tillis. Trevor Berbick had upset John Tate, gone the distance with a peak Larry Holmes, become the first man to beat Greg Page and Mitch Blood Green, upset Pinklin Thomas for the WBC title, and most notably, retired Muhammad Ali. He showed tremendous heart in the demolition job Tyson carried out on him in the opening round of the heavyweight unification series of the 80s. I'll cover that event specifically down the line. Berbick was no bum. James Bone Crusher Smith was the first man to beat Frank Bruno, went 12 rounds with champion Larry Holmes, and went the distance with Tony Tubbs, Tim Witherspoon, and Jesse Ferguson. He also demolished Mike Hercules Weaver and Witherspoon in a rematch. He went the distance with Tyson and continued on against names like Razor Ruddock and Michael Moorer. Pinklin Thomas had wins over terrible Tim Witherspoon and Mike Weaver before he dropped his title to Berbick. He was stopped by Tyson, but it's important to note that the very durable Thomas beat the count before being waved off, and this was the only time in his long career that he was ever knocked down. Thomas would go on to fight Holyfield, Bowe, and Morrison. Tony T.N.T. Tucker, the measuring stick as I've called him before, beat Jimmy Young and Buster Douglas before giving Tyson the toughest fight of his prime. He was undefeated as a pro and on an 8-year-long win streak. Add to this all that Tucker boxed a very intelligent fight with a broken right hand against Iron Mike. He would go on to continue contending against some of the big names of the 90s. Tyrell Biggs was a strong contender for the title throughout his career and was undefeated going into the Tyson fight. He did his best trying to box Tyson, but Kid Dynamite was too sharp. It's also worth mentioning that Tyson's win over Biggs was a good callback of revenge to their Olympic days, where Biggs laughed at Tyson. Biggs would continue on, fighting the who's who of the division. Larry Holmes is self-explanatory. The most underappreciated heavyweight champion of all time, perhaps, with 20 title defenses. The version that Tyson fought had been laid off for nearly 2 years, but he was still formidable and would go on to turn back the clock in the 90s against names like Ray Mercer and Evander Holyfield. Tyson is the only man to ever stop Larry in his long and illustrious career, trumping even the monster effort of Ernie Shavers. This win was incredibly significant in that Tyson had beaten the man who dominated the division following Ali, and who many consider to still be superior to Michael Spinks. Tony TNT Tubbs had wins over Jimmy Young, Bone Crusher Smith, and Greg Page. Against Iron Mike, he did well in the first round, but was decimated in the second. He would continue on, giving Riddick Bowe a tough fight that he was thought to have won by some. And lastly, Michael Jinx Spinks was the man who ended the long reign of Larry Holmes after excelling at light heavyweight. He was the missing piece of Tyson's near undisputed crown, and when they stepped into the ring, Mike Tyson easily annihilated the petrified Spinks in the opening round. This is the fight that many point to when referencing Iron Mike Tyson, the baddest man on the planet. He was now, truly, the undisputed heavyweight champion to every degree. After becoming undisputed champion, he had 2 more fights against Frank Bruno and Carla Truth Williams before the Buster Douglas upset. To briefly overview them, against Bruno, he may not have looked as sharp, but he still got the job done convincingly with the stoppage. And against Carla Truth Williams, he really looked to be on point, and Williams was certainly no bum. In fact, some had him picked in his matchup against Larry Holmes back in the early 80s, a match that he arguably did win. So, with all those fights in mind, all this context, can it really be said that Tyson had an easy road against a weak crop of talent? I'd like to think absolutely not. He was just that far ahead of the pack and reaped the benefits of his ability and hard work. Now, for the other narrative. It is widely believed that Mike Tyson was too far past his best to beat Holyfield or Lewis at the times of their respective bouts. Even before the prison stint, hindsight has fans saying he magically dropped out of his prime between the Williams and Douglas fights. Some say it ended when he peaked against Spinks, and that he looked to be waning against Bruno. Just when was Tyson's prime, truthfully? I suppose only the man himself truly knows. Against Evander Holyfield in particular, most will point to the fight happening in 1990 or 1991 and say how Mike would have won back then. But would he have? Holyfield was out to secure the heavyweight title and didn't fear the aura of Mike Tyson. We know his attributes of stamina, chin, heart, and more. However, he was decked by Burt Cooper on the very night he was scheduled to fight Tyson, and was ultimately dropped by Bowe the next year as well. However, he answered both of those counts. Would Iron Mike, at the time, have done the same to Holyfield? Would Evander have fought him the same way he did in 1996? Or would he have fought Tyson as Buster Douglas did? The both fights also granted Evander great experience, but they also wore him down. Evander wasn't in his prime in 96 or 97 either. In regards to the 1996 fight, hindsight has fans saying Evander was obviously better off and that Tyson wasn't the same. But at the time, Tyson was overwhelmingly picked to win, as Evander was seen as washed up after losing the Bowe trilogy by knockout and a less than impressive win over Bobby Ches. Holyfield can't be marked down for overcoming the odds. The truth is, we'll never know the answer to any of these questions. Now, in the case of Lennox Lewis in 2002, Tyson was seen as past his best and Lewis was the favorite. The fight reflected this as Lennox dominated, but naturally, questions rose on a peak-for-peak bout. They were originally supposed to fight somewhere around 96, but Tyson's team paid Lewis step-aside money to instead face Holyfield, further adding to the thoughts of Evander being an easy payday. Now, why would Tyson not want to fight Lewis at the time? Maybe he felt he wasn't ready. Maybe he just wanted Evander more because of the lost fight 5 years earlier. Maybe he was afraid of Lewis. The truth is, we'll never know. Then we have to consider the sparring sessions from when they were youngsters before the pros. According to Lewis, they met and he got a glimpse into Tyson's knowledge and style. Razor Ruddock wouldn't spar Tyson at the time, but Lewis happily obliged.
But the first day was really hectic, and then the second day was a little hectic, and it got better as it went along. And the last day is, I got actually the better of him the last day. And I remember Customado saying, "Mike, you're gonna meet him someday, don't you do that!" And that always echoed in my mind.
Now, why am I bringing this up? We saw them fight before and after their primes, and in both cases, Lewis was able to survive the early onslaught of Tyson to adapt and get the better of him. I think that speaks decent volume into a potential bout between the two at their best, and cans the argument that Tyson would have so easily squashed Lewis if he were in his prime. The truth is, we'll never know.
And if you could be kind enough, I'd love to do it again. I think I could beat you if you try one more time.
Now, in regards to a prime Tyson beating Holyfield and Lewis easily, let's look back at Tyson during said time period. James, Quick, Tillis. Mitch, Blood, Green. James, Bone Crusher, Smith. Tony, TNT, Tucker. What do all of these men have in common? They all took prime Mike Tyson the distance, and these four men aren't considered to be on the level of Holyfield or Lewis. In fact, Holyfield and Lewis have wins over a combination of the listed gentlemen. Jose Revolta came within a minute and a half of doing the same and even protested the stoppage. My point is that Tyson wasn't some invincible beast who scared you out of there early on every time, not even at his best. However, maybe he would have blasted Holyfield and Lewis out early. Maybe he wouldn't have. Truthfully, we will never know. Now, what are the original point here? That Tyson never had the proper chance to dominate the 90s because of being out of his prime and the prison stint. Look no further for comparison than the greatest himself, Muhammad Ali, the man Tyson was the true successor to in the eyes of the public. In the 60s, Ali dominated the division and was vastly ahead of the curve before being forced into exile. When he returned, the competition had risen considerably and he had eroded due to his lack of training. Still, after a few setbacks, he rebounded to conquer the division again and emerge as the face of a new generation of heavyweights. All this with faded ability and worsening health. Iron Mike had the same near impossible opportunity. After being locked up in 1992, he returned in 1995 to an evolved division, an evolution that had begun when he lost to James Buster Douglas in 1990. Tyson was ultimately halted in his strong return by Evander Holyfield and never fully recovered. Just as with Ali, the division had caught up to him, but unfortunately for Tyson, it had also surpassed him. Now, to be fair, what Ali did was unprecedented and is a part of why he's considered the greatest of all time. Tyson not being able to do the same difficult task shouldn't be charged to his heart. I believe it ultimately is, however, because of two things. The Tyson fan base insisting he would beat the best of them all in his prime, and the unfair shadow that the myth of Iron Mike cast over the careers of his 90s contemporaries. For a more detailed look at the shadow champions across heavyweight history, check out my video linked below. To conclude, Iron Mike Tyson, perhaps the most exciting fighter of all time. Was he underrated? Hell no. The guy is still considered the best despite historical accuracy, as his exhilarating impact still lingers. Was he overrated? Equally, hell no. The man cleaned the division out upon his arrival, an entire generation of heavyweights struggling to find their way after Muhammad Ali all fell to Kid Dynamite. He truly was the baddest man on the planet. Tyson was so far ahead of the curve that it took him self-imploding to aid in the big catch-up. He's one of the all-time greats with a solid career, and we can only ever wonder, what if Cuss didn't die when he did? What if Kevin Rooney weren't fired? What if the rest of Tyson's team, like Jim Jacobs, remained? What if Tyson never associated with Don King? The sad truth and reality is, we'll never really know. But you know me. There's bound to be a what if video down the line from Mike. Subscribe to my channel so you can check it out. Thank you for watching, and tell me your thoughts on the career narratives of Mike Tyson, and if you'd like to see some other career narratives explored. See you next time, and stay frosty.